Thank you, Kate. Amanda's an icon. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. Really nice to see a crowd on the first day of Expo. We're going to have a nice discussion today about color. So
Surprise.
yes, and painting.
Surprise.
So we can start the slides in the background, okay? And the slides will be on a rotation throughout the talk. So Amanda, I wanted to start with memory and thinking about how memory works in your practice. So much of it is about the memory of a place, personal memory, and I wanted to know, what was your first memory of a color, meaning the social dimensions of a color, or thinking about its beauty, its importance? How did you start being engaged with color?
So my mother planted that question. No. I think I was in kindergarten. I had my first set of Crayolas, which is, you got to start with 8. You can't start with 64. And we were on a plane going to visit my aunt. And just as you're on the runway, it's quiet, it's time to take off. And I said, "Where do white people live?" Very loudly. And my mother's, of course, oh my God. She's, oh my God. And then she's like, "Well, your friend Rebecca lives here." And she's like loudly naming all of my white friends. It's like, no, this crayon is white, this one is black. I don't know any white people, I don't know any black people. And so she kind of coaxes me to stop talking about it. And then essentially I'm like, well, those are peach people and brown people. So for like the next year, it's like peach and brown. It's like adamant. So that's my earliest memory of like color, like as a question and like a deep kind of reckoning of like beyond like green is for plants and red is for fire trucks and like this kind of evolution of color. But as long as I can remember, it's just always been like my happy place and my love language.
And you can see slides of colored theory rotating behind us. And I think everyone knows in this room that you are an architect, you're a trained architect in addition to having a visual arts practice. But when did you start painting? Has painting always been a part of your work?
Painting has always been a part of my life. I think painting in a formal sense, or when other people would describe part of my practice as painting, probably actually started in college. So I went to Cornell, I studied architecture. Despite architecture, art, and planning being in the same department, it was very difficult to cross disciplines, actually. And so I hoodwinked my way into the painting department, took painting in the summers, and then eventually set through the studio course. So I actually took a full suite of studio classes. So not only painting and advanced painting, but photography, printmaking, drawing, sort of the whole suite. And actually it was graduation day when the painting department realized that I was not a painting major. But so painting has always been there, but it also wasn't something that I thought would be a vocation. So, the idea that you would go to school to be an artist was not really so welcome in my household. So it was definitely that I was going to be an architect and that this other thing was like a hobby or a joy. So it wasn't until the early 2000s that the decision to kind of embrace that fully really came. So that's when the world maybe decides that I'm a painter.
In that moment, when you were focused on architecture but also painting, what did you feel that painting could afford you that architecture at that moment did not?
I mean, I think painting, initially I was doing representational work, and then the abstraction really came when my grandmother passed away. She led this beautiful life. I'd done some photography of her at the end of her life, and it really was like not enough to kind of paint a picture of her to represent what she was. So this was really my foray into abstraction, but I learned or realized really quickly that architecture also is abstraction in such a strong way. So we associate it with something very concrete. This is a wall, this is a building, these are mechanical systems. But in reality, the way that you're trained to be an architect, you're making one line mean 500 different things. So there's already a level of abstraction. You don't get to stand in your building and go, this is about contemplation. Like the building has to stand for itself. So there's a level of having to translate that made a lot of sense to me when I made that transition. But I think that painting also, at least at the onset offered a kind of freedom that architecture as a practice didn't. So when I was working as an architect, you know, a 64th of an inch off over the course of a 2-block long building adds up. And so you can get in a lot of trouble for not having a kind of level of accuracy and precision. And I think early on it was the idea that you don't have to justify art in the same way that you have to justify architecture. And even in the study of it, you have to really be explaining how you're translating this idea into this form or this medium. And Raymond Saunders, who is sort of attached myself as one of his mentees. I taught in California at CCA with him. And he was very much like, you don't explain anything. You just tell them, and you just put it where you want to. And, you know, and so that was like my first introduction, like, oh, in art, you do not have to explain every line, but in architecture, you do. So there was a freedom that was about the process. And I think as it's evolved, that's really a question I'm starting to ask myself that I was not asking in the beginning. Like, why does this need to be a painting? Or, you know, why does this idea or this gesture need to come in this form and not others? And then you'll often see that I might test out the same idea across media.
At what point did you start to orient yourself towards thinking about race and space? Did this happen while you were in architecture school? Did this come out of, you know, when you began to explore painting? At what point did that emerge?
I mean, I think it's when I was born and raised on the South Side, but I think Chicago is such a segregated city. There's not a moment to breathe where it's not presented to you on a daily basis, and so I think there's a active effort to resist that, or to put it on a shelf sometimes when you need the ability to not have to be burdened with like all that means. But it's so ingrained in our built environment and so ingrained in the way that we speak and the way that we talk about things. And it's kind of monotony of the grid sets up a logic that people hear very practical and they don't understand why you don't understand. And, you know, so to move from somewhere like here to San Francisco or the Bay Area, it's like, well, where do the black people live? People are like, wherever they want. You know, like maybe it's a few neighborhoods and pockets, largely socioeconomic, but in Chicago it's not like that. It's like, this is the dividing line between this community and this community. This is the dividing line. And so the idea that you would associate race and space was ingrained, and then it really was my architectural thesis where I sort of unpacked that for myself, and really has been the question then that's transformed or translated into the painting practice. So it's a lot harder to try to bring those ideas to the fore with painting as abstraction than it would be, say, with sort of spatial strategies.
Yeah, one of my first introductions to your work was through the Redefining Redlining project, which is a really gorgeous project that deals with a really ugly history of redlining as it happened here in Chicago. It also happened to my family in Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from. And it's not exactly painting as we understand it, but it's an intervention into the landscape, so you can think about it through the lens of painting. How do you situate that work in the midst of the rest of your work? Because it's like really a turning point work, I think.
I think it's a great example of a kind of continuum. I think I was sharing, who was I talking to? Marty and Anita or somewhere. I was talking to them earlier about, I have a map at Rhona Hoffman's booth, and it's the city of Chicago from the redlining map of 1939, like reimagined as this kind of shaken map that relocates parcels and allows the city to be equitable for the first time. It's based on this very heavy research paper that Marissa Navarro and others put forth that basically said fully 80% of the black or white community would have to be relocated in order to make the city equitable. So Natalie Moore, who's a journalist here, and I were like, well, how would we do that? I'm like, well, Tanika Johnson's already folded the map. We can't do that. And it's like, let's shake the map. So this idea of shaking it up, but really it began a kind of long-standing, you know, obsession with like, how do you get the everyday person to understand the magnitude of this? And so initially the idea was like, would this red line like move all the way through the city? Would I draw a red line? Would I carry a red line? So it was definitely maybe a painterly gesture, but it had to do with also drawing, if you imagine at full scale. So if you think about architects drawing at scale dimensions, this obsession with like in full scale, in full color, how could you get people to see? and really a 6 or 7 year process to evolve into thinking about what if people could see the buildings? So an idea of like, do I make the building? It's like, well, no. What would be a little more poetic and what would sort of imply the idea also that it's called redlining, but it's actually red shading. Like there's no line. There's actually, so when I first saw those maps, you know, they're colored in. They're not lined. And so, you know, to cover this is like 20 block area. It's like, or maybe just 4 blocks. So we planted 100,000 tulips, you know, which sounds like a lot, but when you start to imagine that, it's just a little tiny microcosm of one little neighborhood, and you imagine that redlining has affected every major U.S. city where there are black people, but also other populations that wanted to be deemed hazardous or not worthy of home ownership. You imagine then the scale of that. So for people to see something that seems like a lot, but is also like digestible. So what's that scale between like when it's not just cute, it's a lot, but you can take it in, and then you can start to extrapolate and imagine what that means times 100. I think that was the goal. So it took a lot, but I think the idea of the red and having to see it almost like something that could be painted or taken in that same way was really important.
So how do you get community buy-in for doing a project like this? I mean, I have the same question about colored theory as well. You know, these are massive site-specific interventions into neighborhoods that might not ordinarily have an engagement with art, or, you know, be thinking about these spaces as, you know, something that can be renewed in any way. So how did you engage the community in order to get the support to do this project?
You know, so I like to say I'm of the community and not of the community, right? So this is the superpower of being a black woman in this way, in that you can just show up. I don't know if Summer Coleman's here, but we did a project together many years ago with Fahim Majid. He had a project called Shacks and Shanties, and he got the business from South Shore community. They were like, why would you say that? Why would you call it this? And why would you do this to these vacant lots? And I mean, he was getting it. And he had us come in to paint the ground. She wanted to paint blue, and I wanted to paint this yellow road. This is 2013. And we had painter suits on, and we painting the ground with toxic paint. And everybody was like, you go, girls. And then he showed up, and they're like, there he is. It's ruining our community. So there's something disarming about, you know, for all the malign, you know, vilified things that might happen, there's something that just seems so, I guess, harmless in this way. So when we were doing colored theory, it would be like groups of friends, and it was like I called the night before, and like you just have to show up. So first of all, it wasn't this like organized community thing. It was like people that know how to get out of Dodge when it goes down. We don't have permission. These are dangerous neighborhoods. We're doing strange things. You know, who are you going to piss off? So you got to be ready to put the paint down. You can't be like, what's going on? You got to be ready to go. The day we celebrated the tulips, they were shooting off the latest gun in the alley right after we'd had the celebration. It was like, this is the reality of these projects. They're not changing, per se, the landscape in that moment. They're sparking the idea. And so, you know, if nobody thinks that I'm not of the community, they're not questions. So why am I any different than the guy selling illegal whatever on the corner, or this group, you know, doing a dance routine they're practicing for whatever. You know, so there's not a foreignness to me being in these areas. And I grew up in Auburn Gresham, so there's also a comfort level I have. So early on with color theory, I really was concerned about buy-in, and then I realized that there was a moment in which the assumption is that I have good intentions for this area. Like, this is not exploitive in some sort of way that maybe an art student that comes and is clearly not of that community asking for something or extracting something. There's not that assumption, and so I take advantage of that kind of privilege, which rarely is present for black women.
Yeah, it's kind of like hiding in plain sight.
Yes.
So let's talk about colored theory, because I think it's a fantastic project, and it uses color in both a symbolic way but also in an interesting formal way. It's a project that locates a specific lived experience in a specific place that's at threat of disappearing, and in the case of the homes, actually disappearing. So how did you get started with that project?
Actually, it's again, these projects come over multiple years. Like there's a kernel of something that starts, or there's an idea that comes that then kind of seeds itself. Sometimes even over a decade. And so, color theory for me was again this question about painting, and this kind of crossroads about architecture. And so, moving back to Chicago, I lived in the Bay Area for a little over a decade, and really thinking about what does it mean to have this degree, to have this capacity, and to still see these neighborhoods looking the exact same way, if not worse, than when I left these environments. And so, Marshall Brown is here. He's a good friend of mine, an architect. Like we're not doing one more community center in the basement. Like the assumption also is that Black architects only should do these kinds of projects, or there's a way in which we can only make an impact in a social capacity, and that we don't have the luxury to just make beautiful things or beautiful buildings. And so it really was that crossroads of like, is there a way to use architecture to make a bigger impact as an idea and not as an object? And so that rumbles, and then it's coupled with, if I'm a painter, like what is a way to break out of painting in the conventional way that I've done it? So here I am, I've made these paintings, people buy them, that's kind of cool. And really scary, Jay's Marshall, he's like, what is your concern? What is your, I'm like, I don't have a concern. Like what is really driving why you are making paintings and not something else? And so those two things rumble for a number of years, in addition to coming back to color is always kind of the happy place. And it actually was the Hyde Park Art Center where I took a class called the Center Program for artists who are established or at different points in their careers that want to break into another kind of way of thinking about things. And Tricia Van Eck, who's got a great booth at the very end of this row at 6018, had recently left the MCA. And she was like, why don't you paint at the scale of architecture? And that was like the pivotal question and moment. It seemed so banal, but also was like so profound. And I was pregnant with my second daughter at the time. And she says I made excuses. It's like, I was pregnant, Tricia. She's like, no, somebody else could paint it. But we like worked through the palette, and could the palette go on structures, and could I paint the structures, and what would that look like? And then we really kind of massaged that idea until we came to the summer that we started to paint. And so that palette had existed for maybe a year or two, and then the application of this palette in a way that would speak to all these other ideas about painting as a practice, shaking my idea that paintings have to go on a canvas, like breaking all that up for me. And so the kind of byproduct or the benefit of my 20 years of architectural training and experience were that I understood those landscapes. So as soon as other people started to notice, it seemed like a social practice project, but really it was a project about color. And so two of the houses are the currency exchange and the safe passage, so there's two yellow houses. So that was like my tribute to Albers on 64th and Carpenter. Nobody on 64th and Carpenter knows who Albers is. But they thought it was crazy that there were two yellow houses. So one lady's like, it's so bright, I can't sleep at night. She was mad. She was like, why didn't you paint them brown? And the guy next door thought it was great because they were trap houses where they're hiding drugs. And they thought I was coming, marking these houses for the police, right? So there were all these other readings that had nothing to do with anything you might hear would be reading into the work. And so I think that was also this introduction to the idea of public art in a way. It was when you open it up in that capacity, it's unauthorized, you haven't really shared with everybody what you're doing, then the interpretations are endless, so it's really powerful then to have to grapple with reckoning that difference between why you might have done it and how it gets read by so many different audiences.
Does artistic labor versus just regular labor come into the equation? You're doing house painting, which is a very particular type of painting, but as a visual artist, as a professional artist, you're engaging this, you're using this technique to make an artwork. So is there a discussion about labor at all in this project or any other project?
There is, but I think the conversation about labor for me comes through ideas about value. So what we value and what we don't value, who's invisible and who's not. Yeah. When people would come up, we painting these houses, when they would question the project, they would always start with a white person if there was a white person there. Then they would start with a man. And then it would be funny because then each person would be like, ask her, it's her, ask her. And I'd be the last person And so even that invisibility of like, even in this kind of labor, the expectation that certain people have the ability or should be doing it or shouldn't be doing it, but also like the value of what that means. When we were doing the Pink Wear Moisturizer house, this woman said, you know, the bank took this house. She knew the family that had the house. And I said, yeah. And she was like, you should send them the bill for your work. And it was like, you know, it's like Sunday morning at like 8 a.m. And she's standing there. She's like, My husband had cut the grass. You know, she's like, I'm serious. I think it's Bank of America. I'm serious. You know, like she really, she really felt like that should be recognized, like the impact, the negative impact they were making and the positive impact we were trying to make, even though it wasn't necessarily a beautification project. There was value in this labor that she was seeing that we were putting in for no reason. We knew the house would come down. She knew we didn't own the house, but we're doing this act of love or this act of care for this piece. And so what does that mean? So labor not in the kind of like capital L, like it's conscious for me, but also you'll see in multiple other projects this idea of the body and like putting forth and what does that mean? Or even with the tulips, you know, almost 500 people out there. The stakes seem low to people to plant tulips, but if I said like, let's transform a neighborhood, people are like, I don't. It's like, let's invest $1 million in this block. But tulips, right? So there's these ways in which you can inject ideas about equity, even if just for the moment, and the hope is that that plants the seed for people to think about what they are invested in or what they find value in.
You also did this project in New Orleans for Prospect.
Yes.
So how did it change? You know, we're in post-Katrina New Orleans. How did it change in terms
I mean,
of
there's
the
a lot of
change in the
sleepless
context?
nights.
Yeah.
New Orleans, Detroit, these are cities you don't play with. Like, they are themselves, and they don't really need other people coming in to save them. Yes, they have issues, but I'm extremely sensitive about those two cities because I think they get selected a lot. Like, oh, should we expand Detroit's limit? It's like, why don't we ask Detroit? Why don't we ask the people who have been impacted? And why don't we then make inroads on what they want to do and not these kind of external factors? So I think Prospect itself is quite fraught, you know, even perhaps having outlived its utility in terms of the power of that first one and what it meant right after Katrina, and now as a kind of like art happening. And so how do you really invest in a way that brings value? And so why would I set up a problem where I'm using color in houses in New Orleans, which is what New Orleans just does. They have a committee that makes decisions about what the color palettes can be, right? You can't just paint your house whatever color you want. So there was special permission given for me to be able to paint these houses in these colors, but it was important for me to also have relationships with organizations that then could continue this work afterwards, or that this work is not an imposition on them. So the original idea is actually that we would sell the paint through an existing company, and that became difficult to even kind of find that kind of entrepreneurship, that enterprise in New Orleans. And so we partnered with the New Orleans African American Museum and then also Xavier University. And so that was really important because then that leads to the ability to both have it live on beyond me, but to have me enter into each of those ongoing programs on their terms. So it's almost like a reciprocal gesture. So I'm doing this as a first move. It could continue, or I could come back in 3 years and do something with Ron Boucher at Xavier, or I could come back and do something with Gia Hamilton at NOAM. So these are ways in which it's not artists kind of jumping in with their notion and bestowing and then leaving. It's, I'm gonna bring the excitement or the visibility that maybe my name holds or that my platform can provide to these organizations, but in a very humble way where I'm just a participant. I'm not there to kind of tell them how to do things. And so I think it was successful in that way, that they both feel like I'm a partner and there's not a timeline on it. So we did a thing, it happened during a time, but now we have a relationship. So this is really just the kind of celebration of the beginning of something that could be decades long, right? As they try to make decisions for themselves about how their work is impacting their city. So it's really important to me.
So let's, since we're on the black slides now. Let's
Yes.
talk about your engagement with the color black and its multitudes, which has come up many times over in your work over the last several years. The project, What Black Is This You Say, which I love that title. It sounds kind of nefarious, but
Yes.
also, it's a funny question as well. And you had the exhibition Candy Lady Black and also the current exhibition that's at Spelman College, which is What We Say, What Black This Is. And all of this arose, part of this arose because of your response to Blackout Tuesday and that performative activism that was happening online in response to the violence against Black lives. So this project has had its own life. It continues on. You did it at Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. You've had a couple shows. You had a recent show, the Candy Lady Black show at Gagosian. So introducing those ideas into a space like Gagosian, the ultimate white cube, how did it play? How did you feel about the tensions that may have been there between the subject matter, voila, and the space itself and what that represents?
Good question. I mean, so it's almost the question of New Orleans in the reverse.
Yeah.
And so it's a different set of problems, right? So how do you make sure that you're not kind of shucking and jiving and performing for the Upper East Side of New York? And so a few things. So one is I work with Antoine Sargent, who's a Chicagoan and a kind of magician himself. And so I think that there was a kind of trust and a comfort with us working together despite the largesse of Gagosian. And then that space, the Park and 75th space, so it's on Park Avenue at 75th, is very boutique-like.
Yeah.
And so there was a way in which I was imagining that the Candy Lady, who's this beloved figure in definitely Chicago, but in most urban settings, and I heard about who told me about the candy truck the other day? Oh, Liz Thompson at the National Public Housing Museum luncheon. She said in Cabrini Green they had a candy truck.
I've never heard of a candy lady or candy truck. Yeah.
She was like, it was a kitted out truck, and you had to like squat down in the truck and be like, I'll take one of those, one of those. And she was like, it was even more of a like shady operation, but it was beloved, this truck. So I got to sit her down and get a visual of what this truck was like. We got to have a Candy Lady truck. But the Candy Lady as a would-be entrepreneur, or this person that should have a kind of a regard and a kind of place of honor for the ingenuity and the ability to both be a kind of steward of the community, but also this hard-nosed business person. Imagine the Candy Lady had a candy store on 75th and Park. And so there was a way in which I could take that as a question and move it there and kind of capture the joy. So the space itself still remains kind of what it is, but the notion that it could have been a candy store, we played around with the idea that I would turn the whole thing into a candy store. And so that's where ideas also of like conceptual color come in. Like, could that architectural understanding of space make this into a retail place? And what's the possibility of then extracting from that kind of level of currency and value into the potential of what should have been had the Candy Lady had her rightful place downtown or in Wall Street or Main Street of whatever city. And so that joy and the kind of memory of candy and summers and wonderfulness that a lot of people have associated with childhood and with that kind of experience translated into kind of joy of that space without having to bring the whole narrative along. And so that really was the kind of goal of a show like that, to not necessarily have to lay out bare for that audience, like the injustice of what should be, but the imagining of what could have been with this figure. And it was interesting because somebody asked me, well, why doesn't she appear? So that's like another 10 years. I'm like, because I'm an architect. I don't know big bodies. I don't know. So like the thinking of moving through space is different than representing or drawing space. I mean, drawing figures, right? Like the figure's always present in the way designers would think about a space, but we're not necessarily drawing the body into the space or making the object of the body. And so that just seemed intuitive to me that it would be about a movement and experience through the space as opposed to something that honored her or had her as a figure in the space.
Yeah, I don't think a representation of her would make sense. That all lives within the paintings themselves. So I want to ask you a bit of a wonky question because we are talking about painting. That particular body of work has these really gorgeous colors that seem like they're stained into the canvas. How do you go about, what is your process in the studio? And you have this new body of work that's up right now at Casey Kaplan in New York. It closes this weekend, so if you're in New York,
Everybody get
go
your tickets.
see
Go.
it.
Leave here. No.
But how do you go about, what is your process in the studio?
It's very research, kind of empirically, experimentally based. So I really am starting to say that painting is like a material for me. So I'm really obsessed with materiality of the every component of it. So my former assistant Jonah Hoffman, who's like I've never met anybody like Jonah, like painting guru. So I first worked with Jonah. I found him at we just graduated SAIC, and it worked in the materials lab there at SAIC, and told him that we needed to turn candy into paint. And he was like, yes. And then when I hired him, he's like, we can't do that. So here's what we're going to do. So we kind of deconstructed the colors and the dyes and then translated them into paint. So I paint almost exclusively with oil. And so he actually, so I like sight read music or something. Like I can mix any color, but I can't tell you how I know what colors are supposed to go into that. And so he can. And so he just watched me and then deconstructed these things. And so we deconstructed Jolly Ranchers and Now Laters down to a palette of 9. And then he tubed those for me. And then we made the paintings. We had like 6 months because it's Gagosian. So we were there every day, all day, doing that. And then the kind of graduation of that, because we were amped and then we were done, was the Carver Blue. So I'd found this patent for a method that George Washington Carver, peanut guy, had made to make Prussian blue from Alabama red clay soil. And so then we set on another 2-year journey of recreating that pigment and then turning that pigment into paint. And so from that pigment, we made casein, which is like a milk paint, casein protein. And these were based on what Carver was saying he would use for these things. And he was encouraging the rural farmers to make their own paints. So casein, watercolor, and distemper. So those are the 3 that we made and then had to learn them as materials. So I'm very versed in oil, but not so much in these others. So it was a 2-year process of saying, well, when I pour this much oil, it does this. When I mix this much alkyd into this, it does this. So it's a lot of kind of kitchen chemistry that I'm doing, and then relying on a lot of his technical knowledge, Jonah's technical knowledge. So he actually came back. He's in graduate school at Goldsmiths in London right now. So he came back last summer and spent the summer with me basically replicating what we had done for Candy Lady Black in terms of the translation and really kind of recipes for how we are now advancing Carver's pigment.
And what motivated this project? I mean, it's pretty incredible what you've done.
At this point, I'm like, why did I do that? No, it was really good, but it was a lot of work. I think the motivation really was like, again, this idea of value or currency. So if you think back to this, it's 1927, which looks a lot like 2027 all of a sudden. So why would the government give George Washington Carver a patent? Why would they do that? And so the audacity, the ingenuity, the imagination for him to be doing this, and then this fascinating story of the real reason why he was doing it, but just me as a layperson, like, and then why would he get a patent for a color? Like, why was that so important to him over all the things that we know to be important that he's contributed? Why would he get a patent for blue? And why would Yves Klein let him do that? No, why would they let him do that? And so it really was driven by the question about the value of a color as a patent as opposed to like Carver's biography or a question. You know, it looks very nice with this like this Amanda rainbow, but I hadn't really been thinking of colors in that way, right? It was really this burning question about like the value of this person's ability to do this in spite of this landscape that he's living in.
And it's called Innovation Blue.
Yeah, so the Prussian blue, in his patent for the Prussian blue, it seemed important to me at first to call it Carver Innovation Blue. So at first I wanted to bring his name into the history, like it's been erased. And so now with the advent of Google and these things where if you type the same thing enough times, then it comes to the top. And those tech gurus in the room know how to like put the algorithms together to make things appear more than other things, right? So how do we make Carver Innovation Blue more important than Yves Klein International Blue? And so at some point, though, through a lot of conversations, a lot of thinking through, well, then what does it actually mean that I did this? So is this Amanda Blue? That's not really my style. So in the idea of innovation or associating this particular process and this particular color with an idea about Black people having imagination and not always surviving, but like imagining. So innovation blue then lands for me as like the right way to make sure that it always is pulling itself into the conversation. When you kind of want to know where does the innovation as a word come? Like 30 years from now, if somebody's like innovation blue, like, oh yeah, that project. So there was a thinking in that way of like, what does language do with this work?
I'd much rather see innovation blue than international blue. Well, we're about to start winding down and move into a Q&A portion of the talk, but I wanted to pose one more question to you, and this is going back to thinking about Black and Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this incredible history, although sometimes fraught, of Black abstraction. We have a number of artists that are enjoying important critical success at this moment. I think about Mary Lovelace O'Neill, who I was on the stage with 3 years ago, Jack Whitten, Raymond Saunders, Stanley Whitten, Suzanne Jackson. It goes on and on and on. And I wanted to pose a question to you about why do Black artists continue to work in abstraction? I mean, you're doing it. There's your peers, Alteron Scambi, Kevin Beasley, so many others. And it seems like a fruitful area to explore, but I wanted to hear from your perspective why it's attractive to you.
I mean, I feel like I accidentally stumbled into it. I feel like there were, from my limited conversations with him, we haven't had like a focused, serious sit down, right? But Alteron's, Kevin and I, it feels like those were conscious decisions that they made as people who've kind of moved through as artists or maybe went to art school and studied. I think that transition from architecture, it was already abstraction, so it just seemed so obvious to me that this made more sense. And really a little bit of a naivete about the limited number of Black women in particular that had enjoyed prominence as abstractionists. So we're only now hearing about these people. But even, right, so your point of even in the moment when they're making the work, there were huge fights about, we don't have time for this. Yeah. We need to be building up representations of ourselves. And so you don't get to just scribble things on paper like that, making stuff up, right? Yeah. So there was this idea that you don't know what you're doing, or it's just kind of, you're selling a bill of goods, and like this is real work. The representation and the technical skill of this is real, and that this is kind of like, and so I think, for me, abstraction just made sense. It's about the material, and so I'm not as worried about, and I don't know, maybe a little swagger because I got a fancy degree. It's like, you're not going to tell me I don't know form and composition. So when I tell you I wanted this painting to look like this, that's what I want it to look like. I don't care. You don't know what it looks like. And so there wasn't a fear of like, what does this mean? It was like a confidence about like, this is the way I want to work. This is the gesture I'm trying to work through. And so I didn't even have sense enough to know not to do it, in a sense, even though, we're living in a kind of contemporary time where there's so many peers now. I think that's a privilege that my generation has that our forebears did not have in that same way. And so I feel super, super lucky. I mean, we're just talking about in New York City, every major museum has a Black artist being celebrated and represented right now. And the Jack Whitten show for me is like, yeah, I can't, there's no words. And so it's good to know that I didn't need that to do what I was doing, but I'm like sitting at the feet of those works for the next iteration of what that means for the kind of expansiveness of the work that I can do, right? Like learning in reverse. It's so powerful. But I feel like I'm just kind of lucky to have, you know, maybe that's not giving enough credit, right? But to have fallen in this in a kind of way that I feel like my predecessors did not have both the luxury and are just now getting their just due. You know, like Mary is an icon, but all of these folks are just now kind of getting the recognition that they deserve.
Yeah, history is being rewritten in new and exciting ways, and you're part of that. So I'm not sure if a mic is going to be run through the crowd, but I encourage anyone to ask any questions that you might have. Hi.
Thank you. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Lauren.
Quick question. So I did have the pleasure of seeing your show at Casey Kaplan. And I was a little surprised when I saw, I think there are 3 or 4 relatively small in comparison to your other works, collage works. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and going back and touching base on your idea about materiality and how you came to those pieces and why collage, because I didn't expect it when I saw it. And I love it. And I love them and I want one.
That's her real reason. No. Lauren and I went to Cornell together. And at Cornell at the time that we were training, and Marshall's here, he's a master collagist as well. Collage was a lot of the way in which architectural academia would have students enter into a project. So it was a very strong way to translate from recognizable things into kind of abstraction. So these are early on. And obviously collage belongs to a whole period of modernism in a way that also tracked with the curriculum that we were learning. But collage is always like it's almost like a security blanket. So it's my go-to as a kind of way to enter, maybe not into the final form, but a way to enter into the project. And so at the point in which I made those collages, we had figured out how to make all the paint. We knew what the paint would do. And then for the first time, I was confronted with this idea of the whole exercise was a new way to make painting. I know I can pour the oils a certain way. I can control their viscosity. This is a totally new animal. And what do I want to do with it? And so I never had that level of freedom in a way. And it was like paralyzing. So there were months where I had the stuff, I had the panels, and then it's like, and I'm like crying, and my husband's like, this is when the artist comes alive. You know, Jason gives for those of you who don't know, my husband is a coach in addition to other things. And so he gives these speeches to my daughter and I when we need motivation that we don't ask for. So he's like, this is the moment when the artist appears, you know. I'm like, no, it's not. I don't know what to do. What should I do? So I make these collages because they're comforting, but they also are the rawest of the material that I'm using. So it's the soil from the clay, and it's the pigment that's like been poured on a surface, but it's dried. And so I can kind of scale it up. And so they're extremely delicate. So there's a care, but there's also then like an intentionality. You get one shot with it, because if it crumbles, or even if you use it, that's it. There's not a bunch more. And so there are maybe 10 collages total. And so that's what they represent, that kind of delicacy. And then they go on then to really talk about the fragility of the material and of the exercise of Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. So here they sit on acres of land trying to educate people and make this great thing. And then at that same time, it falls apart, right, because of all the forces. And so there's that delicacy that is infused in the way the collages were made. But it also then gave me the kind of freedom, or kind of like relax my shoulders to say, you made innovation blue, now you got to innovate, go. There's no, stop being afraid, and then just start pouring, start going. And so that really was the breakthrough. So that's what they represent, both in the larger scheme of the works, but the kind of fragility of it, and then the largesse of that kind of audacity. So you see those two scales in the exhibition.
Thank you.